He stood before his congregation like a soldier of God, a preacher, a father, a man of conviction. Every Sunday, he gripped the pulpit with trembling hands, voice rising through the walls of the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Pensacola, Florida, declaring, "We are called to defend the innocent, no matter the cost." To those who filled the pews, Pastor Paul Hill was a man who lived by Scripture. But behind those eyes of burning righteousness was something far darker, a growing obsession with divine justice that would end in cold-blooded murder. Paul Jennings Hill was born in Miami in 1954, the youngest of three. His parents were conservative Presbyterians, strict but loving, the kind of family that saw church as the center of life. He was intelligent, eloquent, and idealistic. In seminary, professors admired his sharp theological mind. They said he had the makings of a reformer, a young man who could renew the moral backbone of the church. But beneath that intelligence lay a dangerous rigidity. Hill saw the world in absolutes, good and evil, saved and damned. There was no middle ground, no forgiveness for those he saw as enemies of God. By the late 1980s, Hill was ordained as a Presbyterian minister. He and his wife Karen had 3 children and a reputation for devout living. But his preaching began to change. He no longer spoke about mercy or redemption. His sermons became filled with anger, fiery speeches against abortion, homosexuality, and what he called the moral decay of America. At first, his congregation thought it was passion. Soon they realized it was obsession. In 1993, Hill began associating with radical, anti-abortion groups that justified violence in the name of God. He met extremists who called themselves soldiers in the Army of God, a clandestine network that distributed pamphlets defending the murder of abortion, providers as justifiable homicide. The transformation was complete. Paul Hill no longer saw himself as a pastor. He saw himself as a soldier in a holy war. He publicly endorsed the murders of abortion doctors, claiming they were acts of divine justice. His denomination expelled him soon after, stripping him of his credentials. But rather than humbling him, the rejection only hardened his resolve. He began appearing on local talk shows, calmly defending the idea that killing doctors was a moral duty. "I do not advocate violence for violence's sake," he said in one interview. "I advocate the defense of innocent human life." To his followers, he sounded righteous. To the rest of the world, he sounded terrifying. July 29, 1994. It was a Friday morning in Pensacola, Florida. The Ladies' Center, one of the few remaining abortion clinics in the area, was already under heavy protest. Dr. John Britton, a 69-year-old physician, had replaced another doctor who'd been murdered a year earlier outside the same clinic. He knew the risks. He wore a bulletproof vest to work every day. At 7:30 a.m., Dr. Britton arrived with his wife June and volunteer escort James Barrett, a retired Air Force colonel. Barrett's wife, June Barrett, was also helping at the clinic that morning. Paul Hill was waiting. He stood by the roadside holding a 12-gauge shotgun. Witnesses said he looked calm, almost serene. As the truck pulled up, Hill stepped forward and fired 3 blasts into the windshield. James Barrett was killed instantly. Dr. Britton was hit in the head and neck, dying within seconds. Hill then turned the gun toward June Barrett, wounding her in the arm and back before calmly laying down his weapon. When police arrived, Hill didn't flee. He didn't shout or struggle. He simply stood there and said, "I did what I had to do to protect the unborn." The crime sent shockwaves through the nation. It wasn't just another protest turned violent. It was a calculated assassination by a man who once led a congregation in prayer. Investigators quickly discovered the depth of Hill's radicalization. His house contained manifestos, theological papers justifying murder, and letters to other extremists urging them to take up arms for the unborn. There was no doubt this was a man who had planned his crime as a sermon of blood. He showed no remorse. In interviews after his arrest, he remained defiant, claiming he had done God's will. When asked if he regretted the deaths, Hill answered, "No, I only regret that I couldn't save more children." The media swarmed the case, painting him as a symbol of religious extremism in America. Churches nationwide denounced him. But in the darker corners of radical circles, he became a martyr. Pamphlets circulated with his photo under the words, "Hero of the Unborn." Letters poured into his jail cell from supporters who called him a modern John Brown. But the justice system saw through the delusion. In December 1994, Paul Hill stood trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The courtroom was packed. Victims' families sat silently as Hill's defense tried to argue moral justification, that he believed he was acting in defense of life. But the judge swiftly rejected that argument. The jury took less than an hour to convict him. The sentence, death by lethal injection. When the verdict was read, Hill smiled. He looked directly at the victims' families and said, "I am at peace." To the end, he refused to apologize. Instead, he used his final months to write essays from prison, encouraging others to follow his path. In one of his letters, he wrote, "If you believe abortion is murder, then act like it. Words are not enough. God demands action." It was chilling. It was delusional, and it was real. On September 3, 2003, 9 years after the killings, Paul Hill was executed at Florida State Prison. Outside the gates, hundreds of protesters gathered, half condemning him, half praising him. Some held candles. Others held signs reading, "Well done, good and faithful servant." As he was strapped to the gurney, Hill refused a final meal and last words of remorse. Instead, he said, "I thank the Lord Jesus Christ who shed his blood for my sins. I wish to encourage you to do what you know is right to protect the unborn." At 6:08 p.m., the chemicals entered his veins. Within minutes, the pastor who killed in God's name was gone. Witnesses described the scene as eerily calm. No tears, no struggle. Just a man meeting death with the same disturbing peace that had followed his crime. For years after, the case haunted the faith community. How could a man so steeped in Scripture justify murder? How could sermons of love become weapons of hate? The Presbyterian Church released a statement condemning his theology as a tragic perversion of Christian ethics. They called him what he had become, not a martyr, but a murderer. His wife, Karen, quietly moved away with their children, changing their names. She later told reporters that her husband had become a stranger to the man I once married. The clinic where the murders happened still operates today. A small plaque on the property honors Dr. Britton and James Barrett, 2 men killed for doing their jobs. Every year, pro-choice and pro-life advocates gather there in uneasy silence, a reminder of how words, when twisted by extremism, can ignite acts that defy reason and morality alike. Paul Hill's story isn't just about one man. It's about the fragile line between faith and fanaticism. He began as a pastor preaching salvation. He ended as a killer preaching death. His conviction that he was serving God became his excuse to become God, deciding who should live and who should die. And in that transformation, we see one of the most chilling truths of all. Even those who claim to speak for heaven can create their own hell on earth. For the victims' families, there was never closure, only the echo of Hill's sermon still lingering in the air. We are called to defend the innocent, no matter the cost. But in the end, that cost was everything: faith, family, and human life. He was supposed to be the voice of God in a small Alabama town, a man who led his flock every Sunday with passion, conviction, and tears that flowed as freely as his words. To his congregation, Pastor Arthur Burton was a man chosen by the Lord. But behind his gentle smile and kind eyes, a storm was building, one that would end in betrayal, scandal, and blood. Arthur Eugene Burton was born and raised in the Deep South. He grew up in a devout family that believed church wasn't just a place to worship. It was a way of life. As a young boy, Arthur could quote entire chapters of the Bible by heart. By 18, he was already preaching at youth revivals, telling others that God had saved him from the temptations of the flesh. People said he had the gift, that rare ability to make others feel seen, forgiven, and loved. In his early 20s, Burton became a rising star among Pentecostal churches. His voice filled tent revivals across Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. He could move a crowd to tears with a single verse, and when he spoke about redemption, it felt like he was carrying it in his hands. He married a choir singer named Linda, a soft-spoken woman who stood by him through every church he built, every sermon he delivered. Together they had 2 children, and to everyone who knew them, they were the perfect Christian family. But perfection, as it turned out, was just the illusion that kept his world from falling apart. By the late 1990s, Burton had established his own church, the House of Living Light, in a small town outside Birmingham. Membership grew fast. Hundreds filled the pews each Sunday. He preached against sin, especially adultery and lust, often warning his congregation that the devil's hand is found in the bedroom. But behind closed doors, those warnings were born from guilt, not wisdom. It started with a single counseling session. A woman from the choir, 29-year-old Rachel McMillan, had come to Burton for help. Her marriage was falling apart, and she said she needed prayer. Burton listened, comforted her, and promised to guide her spiritually. That guidance soon turned into long phone calls, private meetings after service, and finally, a secret affair that would destroy everything he had built. The relationship continued for over a year, hidden behind Bible study excuses and prayer circles. Burton told Rachel that their love was sanctified by God, that what they shared was different, a divine connection. But when rumors began to spread, Rachel panicked. Her husband found text messages, late-night calls, and eventually confronted her. The fallout was immediate. Burton told her to stay silent, to trust that God would handle the rest. But Rachel wasn't sure anymore if God was listening. One night, in early 2001, Burton's wife found a letter Rachel had written but never sent, a confession of everything. Linda confronted him, her voice breaking as she asked if it was true. Burton denied it at first, then fell to his knees, sobbing, claiming the devil had tempted him. For days he begged for forgiveness. But the damage was done. The congregation found out. Elders demanded he step down until an internal investigation could be completed. Rather than face the humiliation, Burton resigned, promising to seek healing in private. But what he really sought was control. Rachel wanted to move on. She told her husband she would tell the church everything, expose the lies, and free herself from Burton's hold. That declaration sealed her fate. On the evening of July 10, 2001, Rachel was found dead in her car on a remote dirt road outside town, a gunshot wound to the chest. Her purse was missing, and the police initially suspected robbery. But something about the scene didn't fit. Her phone was gone, but her wedding ring remained. Her husband told investigators that Rachel had planned to meet Pastor Burton earlier that night to return church documents. That was all it took for detectives to start digging. Burton denied seeing her. He told police he'd been home watching television with his wife. But the investigation quickly began to unravel his story. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed his car leaving town around the same time Rachel was last seen alive. His cell phone pinged near the location where her body was found, and in his vehicle, police discovered a box of ammunition that matched the caliber of the bullet used in the murder. When detectives confronted him, Burton broke down, not with remorse, but with anger. "You don't understand," he shouted. "She was going to ruin everything God had given me." That single outburst was enough. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial that followed turned the small Alabama town into a circus. Reporters flooded the courthouse. Members of his former church packed the gallery, some weeping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Burton maintained his innocence, claiming that Satan was trying to destroy a man of God. But prosecutors painted a different picture, a man who used religion as a mask to manipulate, seduce, and ultimately silence a woman who threatened to expose him. Rachel's husband testified that she had been terrified in the weeks leading up to her death. Friends told the jury about late-night calls where she confessed she feared Burton's temper. One even recalled Rachel saying, "If something happens to me, he's the one who did it." The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistic tests confirmed that the bullet came from a gun registered to Burton's brother, a weapon he had borrowed weeks before the murder. The defense tried to argue that the affair was consensual, that Burton had no motive to kill her. But the prosecution showed the pattern: the fear of public shame, the loss of his church, the collapse of his image. For a man whose entire identity depended on appearing holy, exposure was death. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict, Burton showed no emotion. He simply bowed his head and whispered a prayer. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Linda, his wife, sat silently in the front row. When the sentence was read, she turned to him one last time and said, "Arthur, you preached about hell your whole life. Now you'll have time to think about what it really means." Burton was sent to the St. Clair Correctional Facility, where he remains to this day. Over the years, he's written letters to Christian organizations proclaiming that he's been reborn in truth. But those who remember him say the man who once promised salvation delivered only pain. Rachel's family never recovered from the loss. Her husband moved away, and her parents maintain a small memorial near the road where she died, a wooden cross with the words, "She believed in forgiveness, not silence." Every year, someone leaves fresh flowers there. No one knows who. The church Burton built was eventually sold, the building repurposed into a youth center. But locals still remember the crowds that once gathered there, hands raised to heaven, led by a man who preached purity while drowning in sin. Reflection. The story of Pastor Arthur Burton is a study in how easily faith can be twisted by ego. He began by warning others about temptation, yet became enslaved by it. His sermons against sin were confessions in disguise. In the end, his greatest enemy wasn't the devil he preached about. It was himself. He wanted to be a shepherd, guiding others to heaven. Instead, he became the wolf that tore his own flock apart. He was a man everyone in his small Michigan town admired. A pastor with a calm voice, a reassuring presence, and a devotion that seemed unshakable. Sundays were full of his sermons, which drew in families from miles around, all eager to hear his words about faith, morality, and the path to salvation. John D. White was the kind of pastor who never missed a meeting, never forgot a name, and always offered a smile to those who sought guidance. He seemed the embodiment of the values he preached: honesty, integrity, and compassion. White was born in the late 1950s in Michigan and grew up in a modest, close-knit community. From a young age, he showed a deep interest in religion, spending hours in church, memorizing scripture, and assisting in community outreach programs. His family described him as dutiful and gentle, a young man who seemed destined to guide others in matters of faith. After completing seminary, he took a position at a local church in a suburban town, where he quickly became beloved by his congregation. His sermons were moving, often focusing on the importance of forgiveness and redemption, and his advice in counseling sessions was considered wise and empathetic. As White's influence grew, so did his reputation. People trusted him implicitly. He counseled troubled teenagers, helped struggling families, and even offered guidance to local law enforcement in moral and ethical matters. Parents felt safe sending their children to youth groups under his supervision, and parishioners frequently relied on his wisdom when making difficult decisions. For years, the man who had dedicated his life to guiding others seemed beyond reproach. But behind closed doors, John D. White was leading a life far removed from the values he preached. For those who observed the community closely, subtle inconsistencies began to appear. Certain parishioners noticed that he was evasive about his personal life. Donations intended for church projects occasionally disappeared or were poorly accounted for. While most were willing to overlook these discrepancies in the presence of his charm and apparent piety, there were whispers, quiet suspicions that the man who preached salvation might have secrets of his own. The cracks in his facade became impossible to ignore in the late 1990s. Local authorities began investigating a series of suspicious deaths in the region. These were cases that, on the surface, seemed unrelated. Middle-aged adults who had gone missing, some with tenuous connections to the church or to White personally. Investigators initially struggled to find a link between the victims, but over time patterns began to emerge. Witnesses recalled seeing White in proximity to several of the missing individuals, often volunteering to help or offering moral support. While such involvement was typical of a pastor, detectives grew uneasy at the frequency of his presence near multiple cases. As the investigation deepened, forensic evidence began to reveal connections that could no longer be ignored. Communication records, travel logs, and witness testimonies suggested that White's reach extended far beyond the pulpit. Police also discovered a troubling collection of documents and personal notes in his home, where he had written obsessively about morality, justice, and his own interpretation of divine authority. These writings, while philosophical on the surface, hinted at a man who believed he was above the law and tasked with enforcing moral judgment in ways others could not understand. The revelation shocked the local community. People who had once welcomed White into their homes for dinner, who had shared their personal tragedies with him, now struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the person under investigation. The very trust that had allowed him to thrive became a source of betrayal. Friends, neighbors, and parishioners expressed disbelief, many struggling with feelings of guilt for having trusted him so completely. Local media covered the story extensively, painting a portrait of a pastor whose public image of kindness masked a disturbing and hidden reality. The arrest of John D. White was methodical and public. Law enforcement officials took care to ensure that evidence was meticulously documented, as the case would quickly become a high-profile trial. White, who had always maintained an air of composure, appeared in court with the same calm demeanor that had characterized his sermons. He claimed innocence, insisting that he had been misunderstood and that his life of service and devotion was genuine. He spoke to the judge and the press, framing himself as a victim of circumstantial evidence, maintaining a posture of moral righteousness even as allegations mounted. During the trial, prosecutors presented compelling evidence connecting White to multiple deaths. They traced timelines, phone records, and inconsistencies in witness accounts that strongly implicated him in activities far beyond what any pastor should ever undertake. The defense sought to discredit the witnesses, suggesting that the patterns were coincidental and the interpretations of White's writings misread. They emphasized his decades of service, arguing that no man who had dedicated his life to guiding others could possibly have committed such acts. Yet the evidence was persuasive. Each connection built upon the next, revealing a pattern of calculated behavior designed to exploit trust. Parishioners testified to private interactions that, in hindsight, seemed manipulative. Former colleagues spoke of moments when White had acted in ways that were controlling or secretive. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who used his religious authority to mask his true intentions, creating a dual life in which he appeared benevolent while pursuing personal agendas that violated every ethical principle he preached. The verdict was devastating for the community. John D. White was convicted of multiple counts related to the deaths and disappearances of individuals connected to his sphere of influence. Sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, he was removed from the pulpit forever. Families of victims expressed relief at the conclusion of the trial, but also lingering sorrow and anger at the betrayal. Parishioners who had once revered him struggled to reconcile their faith with the reality of his crimes, leaving a lasting scar on the community. The aftermath extended beyond the legal system. Churches in the area began to implement stricter oversight and accountability measures, creating safeguards to prevent a similar abuse of trust in the future. Discussions about the vulnerability of congregations to charismatic leaders became widespread. Scholars of theology and ethics cited the case as a cautionary example of how positions of spiritual authority can be exploited when oversight is minimal and personal ego intersects with moral absolutism. White himself remained largely unrepentant, maintaining correspondence from prison that continued to frame his actions as misunderstood interpretations of moral duty. Psychologists who studied his behavior described him as exhibiting a form of moral rationalization in which he conflated his personal desires with a distorted sense of divine purpose. This rationalization, they argued, allowed him to commit acts that were entirely inconsistent with his public persona, while preserving an internal narrative of virtue. The community he left behind struggled to heal. Families held memorials and remembrance services for the victims, attempting to separate the memory of those lost from the shadow cast by the man who had betrayed their trust. Parishioners who had once opened their homes and hearts to White now shared stories of manipulation, control, and deceit, working through grief while confronting the reality that evil can hide in plain sight. Reflection. The story of John D. White serves as a haunting reminder of how appearances can deceive. A man who preached faith, morality, and salvation could also cultivate a hidden life of manipulation and harm. It illustrates the fragile line between trust and betrayal, and the way in which authority, charisma, and perceived virtue can be weaponized. For the community, the question remains, how do you reconcile belief in goodness with the reality of human darkness? And how do you protect those who look to leaders for guidance from the very men who exploit that trust? In the end, John D. White is remembered not for the sermons he delivered or the smiles he offered in his congregation, but for the lives he irrevocably altered, the faith he fractured, and the chilling legacy of a pastor who hid a dark life behind the pulpit. Wayne Jackson was the kind of pastor who could fill a sanctuary with hope. His sermon spoke of love, redemption, and the transformative power of faith. To his congregation in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he was a symbol of moral clarity, a man who led not only in the pulpit but also in the streets, organizing community programs, charity drives, and youth mentorship initiatives. Parents trusted him implicitly, children looked up to him, and the city, grappling with crime and poverty, often relied on his guidance to navigate difficult times. Jackson was born in 1963 in New Orleans, raised in a family that valued religious devotion above all else. From a young age, he displayed an aptitude for leadership, often organizing youth groups and participating in church activities. Seminary came naturally to him. He excelled in theology, homiletics, and counseling. By his late 20s, he was already pastoring small congregations, preaching fire and brimstone sermons one day and offering quiet counsel the next. He had charisma, intelligence, and a seemingly unshakable moral compass, traits that drew people to him in droves. By the mid-1990s, Jackson had established the New Hope Community Church in Baton Rouge, a modest building that quickly grew to a few hundred members. His approach was straightforward: strict adherence to biblical principles, compassion for those in need, and a relentless emphasis on personal accountability. He counseled couples on marriage, helped addicts find recovery programs, and organized food drives in the poorest neighborhoods. His image was flawless, his reputation spotless, and his influence growing with every passing year. But even as he appeared to guide others toward light, Jackson had cultivated a secret life. He was financially manipulative, coercing parishioners into donations far beyond their means, sometimes promising spiritual favor in exchange for contributions. In private, he lived a life far removed from the moral rigor he preached, engaging in secret affairs, manipulating vulnerable congregants, and covering up financial discrepancies within his church. Though subtle, the patterns of deception began to surface in the early 2000s, when a few parishioners noticed inconsistencies in accounting, unexplained expenditures, and sudden withdrawals from church accounts. The tipping point came when one member, an accountant volunteering for the church, discovered that tens of thousands of dollars were missing from donation funds. Jackson claimed it was a clerical error, a misallocation that he would correct immediately. Most accepted this explanation. The man's reputation as a pastor and community leader made it difficult to suspect wrongdoing. But the accountant persisted, quietly gathering documents and cross-referencing receipts. The more she examined, the clearer it became that Jackson had orchestrated a pattern of embezzlement over several years, diverting funds for personal use, travel, and luxury purchases while continuing to present himself as a devoted servant of God. The investigation intensified when a former employee came forward with allegations of sexual misconduct, claiming that Jackson had exploited his position of authority to coerce sexual favors from young female parishioners. She described encounters in which Jackson framed his actions as spiritual guidance, insisting that they were part of a divine plan or necessary for personal salvation. Though hesitant at first, more victims eventually came forward, and what had initially appeared to be financial irregularities began to take on a much darker dimension. Law enforcement and state investigators moved cautiously. Jackson was a well-respected figure, and many community members were reluctant to believe he could commit such acts. But as evidence mounted, including financial records, eyewitness testimony, and corroborated accounts from victims, a compelling case emerged. Police conducted interviews, gathered forensic documentation, and established a timeline linking Jackson to multiple crimes spanning years. The investigators' most challenging task was addressing the depth of trust he had cultivated in his congregation. Many witnesses were torn between loyalty to their pastor and acknowledgement of his wrongdoing. Jackson's arrest in 2006 sent shockwaves through Baton Rouge. Congregants crowded outside the courthouse, some in disbelief, others in anger as the charges were announced. Multiple counts of financial fraud, sexual assault, and abuse of authority. Jackson remained calm, projecting the same composed demeanor that had defined his years in ministry. He denied wrongdoing, claiming that all allegations were motivated by resentment, misunderstanding, or malicious intent. His attorneys argued that his financial mismanagement had been inadvertent and that the relationships in question were consensual, emphasizing his decades of service and charitable work. The trial, however, told a different story. Prosecutors meticulously laid out the evidence, showing how Jackson had systematically manipulated parishioners, diverted funds, and abused his position of power to exploit the vulnerable. Financial statements revealed a complex network of transactions that funneled church money into private accounts. Victims' testimonies described repeated coercion, emotional manipulation, and threats to ensure silence. The courtroom became a place of reckoning, not just for Jackson, but for the community that had placed unwavering faith in him. After weeks of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on multiple counts. Jackson was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, fined heavily, and permanently barred from practicing ministry. The decision brought a measure of closure to the victims, though the emotional scars remained. Families spoke publicly about the betrayal they felt, expressing grief that someone entrusted with their spiritual guidance could also exploit them so profoundly. In the aftermath, the community struggled to rebuild. Church members were forced to confront their own roles in overlooking warning signs, and local religious organizations implemented stricter oversight mechanisms to prevent similar abuses. Scholars of ethics and religious leadership cited the Jackson case as an example of how charisma and authority can be manipulated to conceal wrongdoing, serving as a cautionary tale for churches across the country. Jackson himself continued to assert his innocence from prison, writing letters claiming he had been misunderstood and that his intentions had always been honorable. Psychologists reviewing his behavior suggested that he displayed traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, using manipulation, charm, and moral posturing to achieve personal gratification while maintaining a public image of righteousness. Reflection. The story of Pastor Wayne Jackson is a chilling reminder of the fragile line between authority and abuse, trust and exploitation. For decades, he presented himself as a man devoted to faith and community, yet he simultaneously preyed on the very people he had sworn to guide. His case highlights the dangers of unquestioned authority, showing how positions of spiritual influence can be weaponized when oversight is absent. In the hearts of those who trusted him, there remains a haunting lesson. Even those who preach love, forgiveness, and moral clarity may be hiding motives and actions that betray everything they claim to represent. In the end, Wayne Jackson's legacy is not measured by sermons or charity events, but by the lives disrupted, trust broken, and the cautionary tale he left behind. A story that continues to echo through the pews, the classrooms, and the lives of those who once believed him to be a shepherd of light, only to discover the darkness he concealed. Mark White was the kind of pastor who inspired awe the moment he stepped onto the pulpit. His sermons in Little Rock, Arkansas, drew large crowds filled with people eager to hear a message of hope, redemption, and moral clarity. To his congregation, he was a guiding light, a man whose voice seemed to carry the weight of divine authority. Parents trusted him with their children in Sunday school. Families turned to him for guidance in times of crisis. The community at large saw him as a figure of unwavering integrity. White was born in 1965, the youngest of 4 siblings, in a devout Baptist household. From a young age, he demonstrated remarkable eloquence, memorizing scripture and speaking at local youth revivals. Seminary was a natural path, and he excelled academically, impressing professors with his understanding of theology, leadership, and pastoral care. By his mid-20s, White had become a fixture in local ministry circles, praised for his charisma, knowledge, and ability to connect with parishioners on a deeply personal level. By 1998, White had established his own church, the Living Word Fellowship, which quickly attracted hundreds of members. His teachings emphasized personal accountability, the dangers of sin, and the promise of salvation for those who followed God's path. He counseled individuals, mediated family disputes, and became involved in local social programs, solidifying his reputation as both a spiritual and civic leader. In every public appearance, White embodied the virtues he preached: humility, compassion, and unwavering devotion. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming in the image he had carefully cultivated. Some parishioners began to notice inconsistencies. Funds designated for church projects were unaccounted for. Members reported uncomfortable private counseling sessions, and whispers circulated about inappropriate relationships. Most chose to dismiss these concerns, trusting that the pastor they admired would never harm them. But for a few observant individuals, the signs were undeniable. White was living a double life, one in which his moral authority was wielded as a tool of manipulation. The turning point came when a young parishioner, Jessica Hall, confided in her mother about unwanted advances from White during private counseling sessions. She described situations in which he had used his authority to pressure her, framing the behavior as spiritual guidance. Her mother reported the incidents to the church board, which initially hesitated, given White's reputation and influence. The board decided to investigate discreetly, fearing scandal but recognizing the severity of the allegations. As the investigation proceeded, more victims came forward, revealing a disturbing pattern of coercion, manipulation, and exploitation. White had leveraged his position of trust to pursue relationships under the guise of spiritual mentorship. At the same time, forensic accountants uncovered evidence that White had embezzled significant funds from church accounts, using them to finance a lavish lifestyle that included luxury cars, vacations, and personal property. The juxtaposition of his public persona and private actions stunned the community. A man who preached humility and service was living in opulence, funded by the very people he claimed to serve. Law enforcement became involved as the breadth of White's misconduct became apparent. Multiple charges were filed, including sexual misconduct, fraud, and abuse of power. Investigators worked carefully to document each instance of wrongdoing, gathering testimonies, financial records, and corroborating evidence from former church employees. White, aware of the mounting scrutiny, maintained a composed public image, insisting that allegations were the result of jealousy and misinterpretation. He continued to preach from the pulpit even as the investigation intensified, claiming that God would protect the innocent and reveal the truth. The trial was a media spectacle. Parishioners, community members, and journalists filled the courtroom daily, eager to witness the proceedings of a man who had seemed untouchable. Prosecutors presented a compelling narrative of deception and betrayal, illustrating how White had systematically exploited his authority for personal gain and sexual gratification. Witnesses described the fear and confusion they experienced under his influence, recounting how his charm and reputation had made them hesitant to speak out sooner. Financial experts detailed the embezzlement schemes, showing how church funds were diverted to private accounts and used for luxury expenses while congregants struggled to meet ordinary needs. White's defense team sought to minimize the allegations, portraying him as a devoted pastor misunderstood by a few disgruntled individuals. They emphasized his decades of community service, charitable work, and commitment to faith, arguing that his intentions had always been honorable. However, the jury found the weight of evidence overwhelming. The combination of victim testimony, financial records, and corroborating documentation made it clear that White had abused his position and violated the trust of those who had looked to him for guidance. The verdict was life-altering for the community. White was convicted on multiple counts of sexual misconduct, fraud, and abuse of power, resulting in a sentence of 25 years in state prison. The decision brought relief to victims and their families, though it could not undo the emotional and financial damage inflicted by his actions. Members of the congregation struggled to reconcile their faith with the betrayal, some leaving the church entirely, others working to rebuild trust through new leadership and transparent governance. In the aftermath, the Living Word Fellowship implemented stricter oversight measures, including mandatory financial audits, external counseling policies, and a clear reporting structure for misconduct. The case became a cautionary tale in theological and ethical circles, demonstrating how charisma, authority, and trust can be manipulated for personal gain. Scholars of religion and psychology have since analyzed White's behavior, noting patterns of narcissism, manipulation, and rationalization that allowed him to maintain a public image of righteousness while engaging in harmful private behavior. White himself remained largely unrepentant in prison, writing letters and statements asserting that he had been misunderstood and that his actions were in line with his interpretation of divine guidance. Mental health professionals reviewing his case concluded that he exhibited traits consistent with a pathological need for control and admiration, using religious authority to shield his behavior from scrutiny and maintain influence over others. Reflection. The story of Pastor Mark White is a stark reminder of how positions of trust can be exploited when oversight is lacking. A man who preached humility, morality, and accountability used those same principles as a mask to manipulate, deceive, and harm. His life demonstrates the dangers of unquestioned authority and the importance of vigilance, transparency, and accountability in spiritual leadership. For the community, the legacy is one of caution. The man who promised guidance and salvation instead left a trail of betrayal, shattered trust, and enduring questions about the limits of faith in the face of human fallibility. In the end, Mark White's story is not just about crime, but about the fragility of trust. He promised light, yet delivered darkness. He preached forgiveness, yet inflicted suffering. And he serves as a lasting example of how even those with the closest ties to heaven can hide the most human of sins. Thomas Smith was the kind of pastor who seemed to embody everything a congregation could hope for. In his small town of Greenville, South Carolina, he led the First Light Baptist Church with a blend of charisma, warmth, and eloquence. People admired him not just for his sermons, which spoke of faith, redemption, and personal accountability, but for his active role in the community. He organized food drives, tutored at-risk youth, and visited hospital patients regularly. In every sense, Thomas Smith appeared to be a shepherd guiding his flock with unwavering integrity. Born in 1960 to a devout family in a nearby town, Smith showed an early aptitude for leadership and public speaking. He could memorize scripture with ease and had a natural ability to comfort those in distress. After seminary, he began pastoring in small congregations before ultimately establishing First Light Baptist in Greenville in the mid-1980s. By the 1990s, his church had grown to hundreds of devoted members. Families trusted him implicitly, often turning to him for guidance on moral and personal decisions. He counseled troubled teens, mediated family disputes, and became known as a man whose advice was both practical and spiritually grounded. But behind the pulpit, Smith was leading a life that contradicted every lesson he preached. Those closest to him began to notice subtle signs of duplicity. Church funds were sometimes allocated in ways that did not align with approved projects. Smith occasionally seemed evasive when parishioners asked about financial matters. Some members of the church's leadership began quietly questioning his decisions, but his charm and established reputation often deflected serious scrutiny. The first concrete cracks in his image appeared in 2002 when a parishioner, Karen Mitchell, came forward with troubling allegations. She described instances in which Smith had manipulated her trust, framing his behavior as spiritual guidance while exerting control over personal aspects of her life. Initially hesitant to report him to authorities, Mitchell confided in other church members, and her account sparked a chain reaction. Over time, more individuals came forward revealing patterns of emotional manipulation, coercion, and exploitation. Smith had used his position of authority not only to gain admiration but to maintain power over those who relied on him for spiritual and personal support. The investigation into Smith intensified when discrepancies in church finances surfaced. Donations intended for community outreach had been redirected to private accounts, often under the guise of urgent expenses for church programs. Investigators traced hundreds of thousands of dollars, uncovering a sophisticated pattern of embezzlement that had gone unnoticed for years. It became apparent that Smith had meticulously cultivated trust while simultaneously diverting funds for personal use and luxuries. He had constructed a carefully maintained dual existence, public servant and private manipulator. Local authorities and state investigators worked methodically to document Smith's misconduct. Interviews with victims, financial audits, and corroborating evidence painted a clear picture of betrayal. Parishioners were shocked to learn that the man they had relied on for moral guidance had manipulated the very principles he taught. The investigation revealed not only financial exploitation but repeated breaches of trust in personal and counseling relationships. Witnesses described feeling trapped and vulnerable, often struggling with guilt for having trusted Smith so completely. Smith was arrested in 2004, and the news sent shockwaves through Greenville. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse as the charges were announced. Multiple counts of financial fraud, abuse of power, and emotional manipulation. Even in the face of mounting evidence, Smith maintained an air of composure, insisting that he had done nothing wrong and that all allegations were misunderstandings or exaggerations. He continued to frame himself as a man dedicated to faith, claiming that the investigation had unfairly targeted someone committed to service and spirituality. The trial captivated the community. Prosecutors laid out a meticulously constructed case, demonstrating how Smith had exploited his authority for personal gain while concealing misconduct behind a veneer of piety. Witnesses recounted instances of coercion and manipulation, showing that the abuses were deliberate, sustained, and systematic. Financial experts testified about embezzlement schemes and inconsistencies in church records. revealing the breadth of Smith's deception. The courtroom became a space not only for justice but for communal reckoning. The public confrontation of betrayal by a man once considered beyond reproach. Despite the defense's arguments emphasizing his years of community service and contributions to the church, the jury was convinced of the pattern of manipulation and exploitation. Smith was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 20 years in state prison. The decision brought relief to victims and the broader community, but left lingering scars. Families struggled to reconcile their faith with the reality that a trusted spiritual leader had violated the principles he preached. In the aftermath, First Light Baptist Church worked to rebuild trust, implementing stricter oversight measures, transparent accounting practices, and independent counseling protocols. Community leaders reflected on the importance of accountability, emphasizing the need for vigilance and safeguards to protect against the misuse of authority in religious institutions. The case of Thomas Smith became a cautionary tale, studied by scholars and ethicists as an example of how charisma, influence, and perceived moral authority can be exploited to manipulate and harm. Smith, from prison, continued to assert that he had been misunderstood, framing his actions as consistent with his interpretation of divine guidance. Psychologists and criminal experts reviewing his case described his behavior as a combination of narcissism, control, and moral rationalization. By presenting a public image of virtue, Smith had been able to maintain influence and evade scrutiny for years, all while betraying the trust of those who looked to him for spiritual guidance. Reflection. The story of Pastor Thomas Smith illustrates the fragility of trust in the hands of authority. A man who preached morality and redemption could simultaneously exploit those principles for personal gain, leaving a community shaken, betrayed, and forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that appearances can be deceiving. Smith promised light and guidance, yet delivered manipulation and harm, demonstrating how charisma and spiritual authority can mask a profoundly destructive private life. His legacy serves as a warning. Faith, trust, and moral leadership must be accompanied by accountability, transparency, and vigilance to prevent those entrusted with guiding others from exploiting that very trust. For the victims and the community, the memory of Thomas Smith is a lingering question. How can one protect the vulnerable while remaining faithful to principles of forgiveness and belief, when the very shepherd entrusted with guidance turns out to be the architect of betrayal? In Greenville, the echoes of his sermons remain, but now accompanied by the haunting realization that even those closest to heaven can hide the most human of sins. Robert C. Marshall was a man whose life seemed devoted to God. In his hometown of North Carolina, he was a respected pastor, known for his eloquent sermons, compassionate counsel, and visible commitment to community service. To his congregation, he was a moral compass, a leader whose guidance was sought not only in spiritual matters, but in everyday decisions. Families trusted him implicitly. He presided over weddings, offered comfort at funerals, and was frequently seen mentoring troubled youth. His reputation was untarnished, built over decades of public service and unwavering devotion to his church. Marshall was born in 1945, the youngest of 5 children in a devout Christian household. From an early age, he displayed a remarkable talent for public speaking, memorization of scripture, and an ability to inspire confidence in others. After seminary, he took up pastoral duties in several small towns before settling in North Carolina, where he assumed leadership of a local congregation that quickly flourished under his guidance. His sermons were heartfelt and moving, focusing on forgiveness, compassion, and the importance of living a righteous life. For years, he was the image of a devoted pastor. Community members relied on him for guidance, charity organizations sought his involvement, and the church grew steadily. He was invited to speak at regional conferences, praised for his ability to connect with parishioners and influence change. In every public appearance, he was the embodiment of the virtues he preached: integrity, humility, and devotion. Yet beneath this carefully constructed image, Robert C. Marshall was living a life starkly opposed to the moral principles he espoused. While the details remained hidden for decades, investigations and survivor testimonies later revealed a disturbing pattern of abuse that spanned years. Marshall used his position of authority and trust to manipulate, intimidate, and exploit those who sought his guidance. Over time, a shadow emerged beneath the pulpit, a reality concealed by decades of reverence, admiration, and unquestioned trust. The first signs of trouble surfaced when a former parishioner came forward in the early 2000s with allegations of sexual abuse. She described instances in which Marshall had used his position of pastoral authority to coerce her into sexual acts, framing them as spiritual guidance or necessary for her salvation. Her account, initially met with disbelief, prompted other individuals to speak out. Slowly, a broader pattern emerged. Marshall had taken advantage of the very people he was entrusted to guide, preying on their trust and faith. As the number of allegations grew, law enforcement and child protection agencies became involved. Investigators faced the challenge of documenting decades of abuse, gathering testimonies, and collecting corroborating evidence while confronting a community deeply attached to the man who had once symbolized righteousness. Witnesses described a mix of fear, guilt, and shame, explaining that Marshall's public persona had made them hesitant to speak out for years. They had feared damaging the reputation of their church, losing social standing, or being disbelieved by a community that had revered him. Financial and administrative records of the church were also reviewed, revealing further irregularities. While much of Marshall's wrongdoing was personal rather than financial, it became clear that he had leveraged his authority to manipulate church resources, sometimes in subtle ways, to maintain control over his environment and protect himself from scrutiny. The investigation painted a comprehensive picture of a man who used charisma, spiritual authority, and decades of cultivated trust to create a private world in which he could act with impunity. Marshall was arrested in 2003, decades after some of his earliest abuses had occurred. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Parishioners who had once regarded him as a moral beacon struggled to reconcile their memories of kindness, guidance, and mentorship with the emerging reality of exploitation and betrayal. Court proceedings were highly publicized, drawing media attention statewide. Marshall's calm, composed demeanor remained throughout, even as the gravity of the charges mounted. He claimed innocence, insisting that he had been misunderstood, misrepresented, and falsely accused by those seeking personal attention or revenge. During the trial, prosecutors presented extensive evidence. Testimonies detailed repeated incidents of coercion, manipulation, and abuse of trust, highlighting a consistent pattern spanning decades. Psychological evaluations suggested that Marshall exhibited traits of narcissistic personality disorder, using charm, authority, and moral instruction as tools to control and exploit vulnerable individuals. The prosecution emphasized the profound betrayal of trust, noting that Marshall had deliberately cultivated reverence and loyalty to shield himself from scrutiny while engaging in predatory behavior. The jury found Robert C. Marshall guilty on multiple counts of sexual abuse and abuse of authority. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a verdict that offered a measure of justice to the victims but could never erase the lasting trauma he had caused. Families spoke publicly about their relief at the conviction, while acknowledging that the betrayal of a trusted spiritual leader left emotional scars that would take a lifetime to heal. The aftermath of the case reverberated throughout the wider religious community. Churches in the region began implementing more stringent oversight policies, including mandatory reporting procedures, independent auditing of finances, and third-party counseling protocols to protect congregants. Scholars, theologians, and psychologists analyzed the case to understand how trust, charisma, and authority could be exploited over decades, using Marshall's story as a cautionary example for faith communities everywhere. Marshall, from prison, maintained his innocence, framing his actions as misinterpreted guidance or acts of spiritual intervention. Experts described his behavior as calculated, deliberate, and manipulative, highlighting how he had used decades of pastoral authority to conceal abuse, maintain control, and evade accountability. The case illustrates a chilling reality. A man who appears saintly, compassionate, and devoted can simultaneously perpetrate deep harm, exploiting the very principles and institutions he publicly upholds. Reflection. The story of Pastor Robert C. Marshall serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability inherent in positions of trust. A leader who inspires faith and devotion can, under the guise of spiritual authority, exploit that trust for personal gratification. Marshall's life demonstrates the importance of vigilance, accountability, and transparency within religious communities, and underscores the necessity of protecting the vulnerable while maintaining the capacity to confront uncomfortable truths. The community of North Carolina learned that reverence alone is not enough to safeguard against betrayal, and that even those who preach light can harbor darkness. In the end, Robert C. Marshall's legacy is not the sermons he delivered, nor the lives he guided, but the betrayal, suffering, and fractured trust he left behind. His story is a chilling testament to the dangers of blind faith, the consequences of unchecked authority, and the enduring question that haunts all who place trust in others: can virtue and vice coexist behind the same smile? Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.